I still remember the sound of the radiator clicking in lecture hall 304 moments before my carefully constructed life began to fracture. For 9 years, that classroom had been my sanctuary, the one place where everything made sense. I was Evelyn Carter, assistant professor of literature, respected by colleagues, admired by students, and married to Michael, a successful corporate attorney whose steady presence had shaped 11 years of our lives together. From the outside, we represented stability, achievement, and maturity. Inside our home, however, silence had slowly replaced intimacy. We had become experts at sharing space while avoiding genuine connection. Michael and I no longer argued because arguments required passion, and passion had quietly disappeared years earlier. We discussed household repairs, taxes, schedules, and obligations with impressive efficiency. We occupied opposite sides of our king-sized bed like diplomats maintaining a fragile treaty. I convinced myself that this was what adulthood looked like after romance faded. Then, the fall semester began, and Ethan Hayes walked into my advanced literature seminar. He was 26, older than my typical students, and carried himself with a confidence that immediately unsettled me. He watched everything carefully, as though every conversation carried hidden meaning. Especially mine. Unlike the other students, Ethan never glanced at his phone during lectures. He listened with complete attention, challenging interpretations, questioning assumptions, and forcing me to defend ideas I had taught for years. After class, he often remained behind, asking thoughtful questions that gradually drifted beyond literature. We discussed loneliness, ambition, disappointment, and the quiet compromises people make to survive adulthood. Somehow, he noticed things about me that nobody else seemed to see anymore, including the hesitation in my voice whenever I mentioned my husband. Those conversations became the most anticipated moments of my entire week. That frightened me deeply, too. By October, I had begun making small changes that I refused to acknowledge. I spent extra time choosing my clothes before teaching. I wore lipstick shades I had abandoned years earlier. I replayed our conversations during sleepless nights beside Michael, whose steady breathing only amplified my growing sense of emotional isolation. I hated myself for anticipating Tuesdays and Thursdays with such desperation. Yet every week, despite my guilt, I found myself hoping Ethan would remain after class once again. The anticipation itself became intoxicating, a secret emotion I protected from everyone, including myself. I knew danger was approaching very quickly. The tension between us intensified throughout the semester. There was never a direct confession, never an explicit acknowledgement of what was happening. Instead, there were lingering silences, sustained eye contact, and conversations that felt increasingly intimate despite their innocent appearance. I began dreaming about him. I woke feeling ashamed, frightened, and undeniably alive. The realization that I desired another person after years of emotional numbness should have horrified me. Instead, it awakened something inside me that I thought had disappeared forever. That discovery felt both exhilarating and catastrophically dangerous. I could no longer pretend ignorance about my own heart now. Everything changed on a rainy Thursday in early November. The storm outside transformed the windows of Lecture Hall 304 into walls of moving gray water. Throughout the seminar, I could feel Ethan watching me. He barely wrote a note. When class ended and the other students hurried toward the long holiday weekend, I remained behind my desk, organizing papers I knew I would never read. I avoided looking up because I already understood with terrifying clarity that something irreversible was about to happen. The air itself seemed charged with expectation and inevitable consequence. I could barely breathe anymore at all. The classroom door closed behind the last student with a soft click, that echoed through the empty room. I stood motionless beside my desk, listening to the rain strike the windows. Then, I heard Ethan's footsteps approaching. They were unhurried, deliberate, and somehow more frightening than any sudden movement could have been. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and quiet. "You seem unhappy," he said. For the first time in years, I realized someone had truly noticed. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words never arrived. Instead, I stared at him, utterly unable to speak. The silence stretched between us until it became unbearable. Ethan didn't move closer immediately. He simply stood there, rainwater darkening the shoulders of his jacket, watching me with an expression that combined concern and certainty. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said softly. The words struck something fragile inside me. For years, I had performed the role of successful professor, devoted wife, and emotionally balanced adult. Standing in that empty classroom, exhausted and exposed, I suddenly realized how desperately tired I was of performing. "I should go home," I whispered, though neither of us believed I was actually leaving. Ethan stepped closer, slowly enough that I could have stopped him. I didn't. Outside, thunder rolled across the city skyline, and the fading afternoon light turned the classroom into a world entirely separate from reality. He reached for my hand, hesitating just long enough to give me a choice. When our fingers touched, a shock of emotion traveled through me so intensely that I had to close my eyes. It wasn't merely attraction, it was recognition. What happened next was not sudden. It was the culmination of months of loneliness, attention, fantasy, and emotional hunger. We crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed. In that moment, I stopped being Professor Evelyn Carter and became simply a woman making a devastating decision. Even while it happened, some distant part of me understood that I was dismantling my marriage, my career, and the identity I had spent decades constructing. Yet understanding the consequences did not stop me. That was the most frightening realization of all. Afterward, the classroom felt transformed. The storm outside continued, indifferent to the catastrophe unfolding inside me. Ethan looked at me with an expression I could not fully understand. There was tenderness there, but also certainty, as though he believed we had begun something rather than ended everything. The realization filled me with immediate panic. I gathered my belongings with shaking hands and told him that what had happened could never happen again. He listened quietly, but something in his eyes suggested he did not believe me. The drive home through the rain felt unreal. Every red traffic light reflected across the windshield like a warning signal I had ignored. When I finally pulled into our driveway in Lexington, the house looked exactly as it always had, warm, orderly, and safe. Michael had prepared dinner. The familiar scent of garlic and rosemary drifted through the kitchen. Seeing him standing by the stove, smiling when I entered, nearly broke me. His kindness felt unbearable because I had already betrayed it. For the next several days, guilt became a physical presence that followed me everywhere. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. Every text notification sent a wave of terror through my body. I kept expecting disaster to arrive, yet the silence only intensified my fear. By Wednesday evening, I understood that I could not continue living inside the lie I had created. When Michael brought home wine and takeout for a quiet evening together, I realized the moment I had been dreading had finally arrived. "Michael," I said, gripping the kitchen counter to keep myself standing. He looked up immediately, sensing something had changed. I tried to speak calmly, but the truth burst out in fragments. Each confession destroying another piece of the life we had built together. As I watched the shock, betrayal, and heartbreak spread across his face, I understood that some decisions create consequences that no apology can ever repair. Then Michael asked me one question I had never prepared myself to answer. Was he worth losing everything? I opened my mouth, desperate to say no, desperate to reclaim the woman I had been only a week earlier. But the answer refused to come. Because the terrible truth was that this had never been about Ethan alone. It had been about loneliness, silence, regret, and every unspoken ache I had buried inside myself for years. Michael stared at me, waiting, outside. The autumn wind rattled the windows of our perfect house, and for the first time, I understood that some ruins remain standing long after everything inside them has collapsed. And ours already had collapsed.